Coming up.
Well, we just had a panel about a formerly trusted news source propagating blatant misinformation. And what I find interesting about that is it's almost like a wake-up call to Canada.
I heard what you said, but I'm sure you're familiar with Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon has very publicly talked about flooding the zone with a word that would be unparliamentary.
Well, it's interesting you spoke about disinformation on the part of politicians, because we saw a very recent example of that when the parliamentary secretary to the government House Leader, Liberal MP Mark Garrettson, spread blatant disinformation. He did so willfully, all for his political advantage, and
Sammy Doon is one. They enjoy nonprofit status currently in Canada. The Houthis in Canada, again, they're legally allowed to fundraise, recruit, and organize, and they both should clearly be banned.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
So we're now entering our second hour. I'd like to welcome our witnesses for today. As an individual on Zoom, we've got Mr. John McAndrews, Managing Director, Digital Society Laboratory of McMaster University, and from the National Security Center of Excellence, Neil Kushwaha, who is the chairperson. I'm going to...
Now, very interesting, Mr. Kushwaha, you talked about foreign companies as opposed to governments. They're obviously, they're different entities, right? Government is completely different. But what I found really interesting was when you talked about a foreign company becoming an organ of the state, as in, I would say, like akin or essentially carrying out a government's bidding. Is that an accurate framing?
It's a way of saying it, indeed. Please continue.
Yeah, but sometimes government does things, and it might be deliberate, or it might not be deliberate, but at the end of the day, it can result in misinformation. And disinformation. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm just going to have a quick look here to get the date. I believe it was September 17th, 2024. And the Trudeau Liberal government actually gave $340,000 to a film, to the production of a film that appeared at the Toronto International Film Festival. And this was a pro-Russian film, as I understand it. Now, I don't know that anybody went through this and said, okay, this is exactly what we're doing. But even if it wasn't, if it was, somebody should be fired. If it wasn't, it seems to me like quite a mess up when we're giving $340,000 of your money, my money, our money to pro-Russia propaganda. Do you have anything to say about that?
I'm not familiar with that particular case or scenario, but it is an interesting piece of information you're providing, and based on what you've shared, I think it's very difficult for us to point to any politically elected individual in that decision-making process. And I think that the challenge that we have, as I pointed out, is sometimes it's our civil servants that make these decisions that harm. And there's I would say, let's clarify that. There's three different types that we characterize of insider threat actors. Okay, there's some that are non-malicious, without intent. Oops, I did this, I had no idea. And then there's malicious with intent. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then there's also non-malicious, but with intent. And that's the really weird one. I can say, I'm not malicious, but I really thought this would be better, so I did it. And yes, it contravened policy, or it didn't have the right outcome.
Right. What's interesting to me about what you're saying there is that so often in misinformation and disinformation, we assume it's a problem that impacts us from elsewhere, that it is external coming into Canada. But, the example I just gave, and I know that there are we just had a panel about a formerly trusted news source propagating blatant misinformation. And what I find interesting about that is it's almost like a wake-up call to Canada that, sometimes when we have $340,000 being given to a film that shouldn't be, or we have news sources, or as parliamentarians, we suffer from it. I don't know that this is just someone else's problem that impacts us. I think we need to look in the mirror. What do you say about that?
Interesting way. I like the idea of looking in the mirror, indeed. I think it works well at a diplomatic relations level as well. I feel also it's interesting to note that when funding is received by external parties, we trust them to do certain things for Canadian interests. And while they may continue down this path, those perspectives may change as they result in their reporting or whatever work they may do. And in this case of film, I think it's it's a little bit of a complicated matter there, that one may need to oversee them. And there's just so much funding that we give to so many different entities, NGOs, to even supporting entities around the world, that it would be very difficult to have that kind of oversight with our small taxpayer income.
You raise an excellent point there as well, and that is that, so often people will be very quick to label the right as, this is a problem just on the right, but there's actually a fair amount of money that comes in on the left, and I hate using right versus left. I would call them extremes. We'll just call it extremes. But there is a lot of money that comes in illegally from American NGOs, for instance, that I think a lot of people would find the views as being not within Canadian norms or not within the mainstream, and that funds people who are carrying out extremes in Canada. And this happens, it's seemingly during elections. There's one name, is it the Tides Foundation? Is that the one? Yeah, the Tides Foundation. My understanding is that money sometimes comes up into Canada, and then that propagates local disinformation. I mean, how do we stop that?
Yeah, I mean, especially with our allies, coming from our states and the allies, as we call our allies, right? So I feel your pain, and I will say that it's something that we see. And Canada's not the only country that's facing this. When we speak with other countries around Europe, they're facing it, and to Asia, they're facing it, and to African states, they're facing it. It's unfortunate, and I think it's just more obvious now. It's always been there.
Mr. Baines, you're going to pick it up from there.
I noticed that you mentioned Finland, and I've heard about Taiwan as well. Like, previous witnesses have also stated that Finland and Taiwan are examples to follow when it comes to fighting misinformation, disinformation, due to their proximity to Russia and China, respectively. Maybe could you expand on their programs and perhaps suggest other ways we can immunize Canadians from the effects of misinformation and disinformation?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And so in Finland, obviously, as you described, they do have a significant challenge that's right at their sort of doorstep or neighbors, and not too far from ours as well, if you think of it. And they took action immediately. And in their model, much like, I say, opposing to Canada, our policy may come for education from a federal level, but it's delivered at the provincial and territorial levels. And it's very difficult to govern from Canada, appropriately govern from Canada, as Finland does it. So I think, similar to their model, we need to come up with methods. And I'm not suggesting that this community does it, or I'm not suggesting that I'm proposing any policy methods to drive from federal down to provinces and territories. But I'm suggesting that something needs to get done to normalize that kind of information, as we do normalize mathematics or physics and science or language. And to that effect, Finland did an amazing job on that, in teaching the kindergartners how to do this, and giving them silly examples to real examples, as you would to any child. And it helped them grow. Even the elderly and the retired that would have difficulty with technology and receiving information from their friends and their neighbors, having a conversation at a coffee shop, can then really consider what they're hearing and say, you know what, let me look that up. And I know how to do that, because it's now part of my ecosystem, my living and my being.
We're now hearing about Russian connections to Canadian social media influencers. In your view, as a political scientist, what are the greatest risks related to misinformation and disinformation that might not only affect the work of Parliament and parliamentarians, but also future elections?
I appreciate the question. It's a big one and a difficult one. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think it's the ability for Canadians to make judgments about what's true and false, for them to make informed decisions, Canadians benefit from good information and make good decisions based on that. Likewise, in my view, no political party is advantaged by polluting the information space in the medium term. And so I think there is common cause to be built around
if
reasonable...
I could, sorry, I heard what you said, but I'm sure you're familiar with Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon has very publicly talked about flooding the zone with a word that would be unparliamentary. They talk about very openly on the far right about cognitive warfare. There seems to be, at least on the political spectrum, some advantage to having a post-truth environment where facts don't actually matter and political parties get to make it up as they go along. Is that not the case? Have you found any correlation or causation theory as it relates to the rise of right-wing populism and misinformation? And I know you've done work on COVID and vaccine hesitancy. Is there a correlation there between political ideology and partisan gain to be had?
Yeah, I don't think we want to pretend that there's no politics in misinformation. What I want to underscore to the committee is that there is a public interest that is served, and indeed the interests of major political parties in the medium term in building a resilient ecosystem. That it is entirely appropriate for this committee to spend time learning about specific examples and how they can drive lessons from those examples. But when the committee turns around to make recommendations, when there are laws proposed and rules proposed, we don't, I think, want to make the impression on Canadians that those are designed to advantage a particular political party.
Agreed. And with getting really to the point here, your Digital Society Lab has done some work on regulating digital election advertisements. Do you have, from that work in 2019 and 2021, do you have specific recommendations you'd like to present to this committee for our consideration, given that we're, potentially in a looming election and seemingly pretty far behind on having any real oversight?
Thank you again for the question. I was not directly involved in that research project, but I'd be happy to follow up with the committee on behalf of those researchers. I would say that, as I said in the opening statements, the importance of civil society and of academia in being empowered to undertake the detection of misinformation and being able to provide that to the public in an accessible way is critical. And I commend the work of my colleagues in the Canadian Digital Media Research Network. You heard earlier from Angus Bridgman of the Media Ecosystem Observatory. They are doing excellent work in serving Canadians in terms of the health of the media ecosystem.
Okay. We're going to go to Mr. Cooper now for 5 minutes. Mr. Cooper, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kushwaha, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing. You spoke about Beijing's interference, that their tactics in many instances are intricate, and to that end, it's difficult to address by way of law enforcement tools, for example, the laying of criminal charges, for instance. We saw in the 2019 and 2021 elections a concerted effort by Beijing to interfere. In the 21 election, it's now well established that there was a fairly sophisticated campaign to re-elect the Liberals and defeat certain Conservative candidates, including MPs Kenny Chiu and Alice Wong. We could be heading into an election any time now. In your opinion, are we at greater risk, lesser risk, as great of a risk of seeing such interference activities on the part of Beijing or other hostile foreign states as we head into the next election?
Yeah, I think foreign state adversaries are going to play their game. And they're going to do it for their personal gains of their own reasons. Whether they're a politician doing it for their personal gain or a group of individuals doing it for personal gain, or if it's for the better of their country, their perspective. So there's really no escaping that reality. It's going to happen. It's how we can handle it. Now, how we can do things to possibly change that, I think It's important to note we do about $3.4 billion a day in trade with the United States, and that's 66% of our entire trade, about, let's say, round figures in last checking on global affairs. If you want to influence another country into doing what you need them to do, whether it be following norms or knocking it off, if I may say, in terms of foreign interference, you need something to push them with, and we don't have good trade capacity to do that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you spoke about disinformation on the part of politicians, because we saw a very recent example of that when the parliamentary secretary to the government House Leader, Liberal MP Mark Garretson, spread blatant disinformation. He did so willfully, all for his political advantage, and
Point of order.
he...
Chair, I don't think this is time or place to have personal attacks on other parliamentarians. It's unparliamentary language. You said yourself that we were having a good series of testimonies here, and I think we need to keep it
I'm going to
clean.
allow Mr. Cooper to continue with his questions. You've got 2 minutes and 35 seconds, Mr. Cooper. This is a study on disinformation and misinformation and the impact it has on the work of parliamentarians. There is a broad range that members can go in their line of questioning on this. But, Mr. Cooper, you have the floor. Go ahead, please.
Chair, just on that point, if I may continue.
My time.
Just on that point.
Okay.
It could be because if a member is questioning another member's speech in the House, that could be a question of privilege. I'm just saying.
I think so. I'm gonna on the point of order that Ms. Shanna. I mean, it's a matter of public record. There's, he's not. Mr. Cooper is not making anything up here. So I'm gonna ask him to continue. That addresses your point of order. Mr. Barrett, on this point of order, go ahead.
On that point of order, with respect to whether or not a member's speech in the House is being questioned, Mr. Cooper is very clearly staying relevant exactly to the subject that we're dealing with, Chair. Yeah, okay. And his question with respect to Mr. Garretson deals with an admission of intentional spreading of false information by the member that he named, something for which that member admitted doing under threat of litigation. So this is important. He should be afforded some time to restate his question, Chair.
I'm pretty sure I've addressed that in the context of what this study is all about. There have been very specific examples cited on both sides of disinformation and misinformation, or as I like to call it, lying, being spread. And I will continue with Mr. Cooper for 2 minutes and 35 seconds, given the fact that we've granted that latitude and those specific examples to all members of this committee. Go ahead, Mr. Cooper.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I guess the truth hurts to Liberals because Mr. Garretson...
Point of order again, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
We can, and you rightly said
just
this,
because
Chair,
you don't like what somebody's saying doesn't make it a relevant point of order.
Love what everything has been said today. Really appreciate the testimony of our witnesses. If we're going to have an honest, a solid study out of this, let's keep the partisanship and the hacks out of it, please.
Well, I've heard partisanship on all sides today, Ms. Khalid, so I'm going to continue with Mr. Cooper. Well, if anybody has a point of order, cite under the rules and regulations what that point of order is, and I'll consider it. Because you don't because anyone doesn't like what somebody says, doesn't mean that it is a relevant point of order. Mr. Cooper, go ahead for 2 minutes and 35 seconds, please.
Well, thank you for that, and it is my time, and I can use it as I wish. I noted that the truth hurts for the Liberals because Mr. Garretson spread blatant disinformation for his political gain, and as a result, he had to settle in a legal action that was taken against him. And we saw further disinformation from none other than a network that claims that it is the most trusted news network in Canada that fraudulently doctored a video of Pierre Poilievre, and we had ministers in this government, including Minister St. Onge and MP Nur Mohammed, actually defend the doctoring of that video. So it just goes to show that when it comes to the Liberals, they're very much in favor of disinformation, just so long as it isn't against them. But in any event, the point is made. Mr. Bourgeois, again, I apologize. You spoke a little bit about Bill C-70. One of the tools in Bill C-70 is a foreign influence registry. Is that something that you see as being a useful tool to counter misinformation and disinformation from hostile foreign states?
On to parliamentarians. On to parliamentarians or in general?
In general.
So...
And maybe just to provide you with some context,
please.
When we look at the interference activities that occurred in the 2021 election, by the Beijing regime, there were certain Canadian-owned Chinese language media outlets that amplified this disinformation, that had links, partnership agreements with the PRC. They would now have to register. So it's in that context that I raised the...
I'm going to ask for a quick response, if you can, in 20 seconds or 30 seconds.
Short response, I don't think it's going to make any difference. I don't think a registry is going to make any difference because you'll just use somebody else. If it was my team doing it, let's say, for example, behaving this way, and I had a team of people, and 3 of them were on a registry, I wouldn't use them. Very simple. I would still perform the action. I would still get my results.
Okay, thank you.
South of the border, when we had a presidential candidate sending misinformation about FEMA during the hurricane. There is a responsibility as parliamentarians, as political candidates, to not put out misinformation that could actually endanger people. Would you agree with that? And how can we make sure that folks who are in these positions of, I don't want to say authority, but a position of influence, exactly, thank you, to understand that the ramifications of what is being put out there has real-world consequences?
I think the idea of saying, when you ask someone a question in a political level, rarely do they say, I'm really sorry, I don't know. And that humility of just saying, let me look into that. I'll get back to you. I really don't know. You rarely hear that. And I feel like it should be okay. Mm-hmm. You can't remember everything. You can't have somebody whispering in your ear every moment to have it perfect. You will mess up my name. It is complicated. So it's okay to say, I don't know. And I think if we promote that kind of idea that, let me look at it, it'll also help promote the concept of, it's okay not to know right away. Let me look into that. You gave that to me. That's very interesting. Let me look into that. No, react. You don't have to. It's okay.
Now, in terms of the channel, when you have social media platforms that are, and I'll give the example of X or previously Twitter, that is allowing misinformation, disinformation to be propagated, what role do social media giants have in terms of their responsibility to fact-check information?
I feel like Canada tried really hard to push that pressure upon media giants to get them to fact check, and what happened is they backpedaled, obviously, as you know, and removed all access. So unfortunately, that harms Canadians in a different way. I don't know if there's really any real good answer to this from my side, so I apologize. I don't think I have a solution to that of any kind or even thoughts. I actually have, unfortunately, negative thoughts to that.
Okay.
It'll be abused is what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Mr. Barrett for 2.5, go ahead.
So we've heard reports of hostile foreign entities, foreign regimes that have been funding violence, like the pro-Hamas, pro-terror, anti-Semitic demonstrations that we've been seeing on Canadian streets without any consequences. And this is as a result of a failure by the government to actually designate these groups for what they are. And Sammy Doon is one. They enjoy nonprofit status currently in Canada. The Houthis in Canada, again, they're legally allowed to fundraise, recruit, and organize. And they both should clearly be banned. And so the question is, what should the government be doing to detect this foreign-backed interference that leads to intimidation, both of political and non-political actors, the promotion of hatred on our streets, because these are two very clear, using open source information and just simple observation allows people to determine this, but these groups are self-declared in doing what they're doing. So we've made the assertion they should be banned. What should the government be doing to detect these activities in a proactive way? Because what you permit, you promote, and so Canadians would believe that the information being spread by these bad actors is okay. It's legitimized by the government by virtue of the fact that they failed to take any action to criminalize these groups.
It's interesting. What you permit, you promote. I would hope that the public has the sense to look things up and make educated decisions and formulate their own outcomes. But I see where you're going in terms of what you're attempting to describe, and I appreciate it. So I think that what can the government do? From a policy perspective, I think there's quite a bit in place already. And I think the challenge is that funds come from many sources. I'll say what we've tracked at the center, we've been able to track. We have an entire technology team. And you can see transactions coming from foreign sources into Canada over cryptocurrency, but I also see them leaving Canada. I found organizations in Canada that will say, hey, we'll handle your transactions and we'll funnel them all into this one entity, and then we'll funnel them out. So you can no longer trace source to destination. Now, while you can see the wallets, you don't know exactly who owns the wallet. Nevertheless, you can see transactions happening. And that complicates things because it looks like we're sending money out as well as receiving. So are we performing some form of influence upon others as much as they're performing on us? And if it's the citizens that are doing this, it can be considered unlawful. You have to have evidence and you have to have intent, in Canada at least. And I feel that those are very difficult to capture in the financial realms, even for FinTrack, or the RCMP, notably, because those wallets are meant to be anonymous.